Click. And we're live without Kate. It is Wednesday, June 9th, 2021, 5:01 p.m. And I believe yesterday was the day of the release of Mark Polymeropoulos' book. Is that right, Mark?
That's right. Yesterday was the publication
Because
date.
they always come out on Tuesdays. I don't know
is
why.
that true?
Yes. Publication dates for books are always on Tuesdays for reasons that are lost in the mists of time.
Without Kate.
Oh, now I'm getting feedback from myself.
Wednesday.
All right.
5:01 p.m.
Whoa. I don't know what's going on here.
Where is that coming from? Do you have another
I don't
window
know.
open?
The day of the release of
I don't know where it's coming from.
Polymeropoulos' book. Is that right, Mark?
That's right. Yesterday was the publication.
I don't think it's
They
from
always
me.
come out on
This is surreal.
Tuesday.
Is it from you, Mark?
I don't
Wait,
know
is that
why.
true?
Yes.
Wait, mute Mark.
Publication dates for books are always on Tuesday.
Yeah, it's coming from
It's
Mark's
Mark.
site. It's
Okay.
It's coming from Mark's computer. Mark, do you have the
Feedback.
the Twitter
All right.
open or some other window that's playing this?
I don't know what's going on here.
Where is that coming from? Do you have
I
another
don't
window
know.
open?
The day of
It's playing. I
There you
think
go.
it's. All right, there we go.
But I did something.
Yeah,
There we go. We're
it's good. Anyway, the book is out. It is Clarity in Crisis: Leadership Lessons from the CIA. If you have not already bought it, you should buy it. And if
gonna
you
drop a
have
link to
already
it in a
bought it,
second.
you should buy another copy. Mark, when you were first on the show, you were on talking about directed energy weapons, Havana Syndrome, Russian likely attacks on U.S. intelligence personnel and diplomats. You have now written a book that's about something else. So tell us about it.
Sure. So first of all, thank you for the promotion there. So you're right, exactly. If you haven't purchased the book, I would love for you to buy it. And then if you have, buy another copy, and I'll sign it. So this has been an amazing journey for me. It almost has been therapeutic because I did suffer a lot, and that was a whole other episode about the directed energy attacks. But in reality, I had a 26-year career at CIA, which was pretty incredible. I served and lived all around the world and did some incredible things. And in that time, I developed a leadership philosophy, and it was based mostly on failing a lot. So this is a book about leadership. It's called Clarity in Crisis: Leadership Lessons from the CIA. But in essence, some of the themes are how you deal with failure and adversity and humility. So it's not going to be this chest thumping group, book from a former Navy SEAL, but it's going to be, I think, it's real. People are going to understand this, and ultimately, it's designed for those in in the private sector and business and academia and education, doctors, nurses, and how they how they manage leadership in times of ambiguity, in times of stress. And boy, can you think of a better time than what we've just gone through the last year.
So what's the what makes leadership lessons from the CIA different from leadership lessons from big business or the U.S. Congress or the military? What's distinctive about leadership lessons from the CIA?
Sure. So I think that one of the things that well, first of all, there are a lot of parallels. So so I think as we go through and we talk, in my book, other people will relate. But ultimately, a CIA case officer, is a bit of a different breed. Now, a lot of people do live in kind of nice places in Europe, but I, for one, lived in some of the harder places in the Middle East. So, you learn about kind of living in adverse conditions. But the key thing about an operations officer, about a case officer, is that you learn to operate alone, and that's where we're different. When we spot, assess, develop, recruit, and handle an agent, and an agent, of course, is not an American. An agent is a spy that we recruit from another country. You're doing all this completely on your own, whether you run a surveillance detection route, whether you're there in an operational meeting having to make decisions. And so that's where I think, I learned a lot that I think that I wanted to kind of pass forward, because we're just a different breed. We certainly work sometimes in team settings, but most of the time it's on your own, and how you develop an officer to do that, how you kind of cultivate him or her through their careers, and ultimately how you teach them to lead others who have to lead in a CIA station, but lead a bunch of individuals who are going to be operating on their own. And so that's where I think that, CIA offers a really different perspective. And so, that's what I want to kind of pass forward. And one of the things I love doing is educating kind of the American people of the world about the CIA, which I really believe is an indispensable institution, often misunderstood. But I think people are going to love this book because there's leadership lessons and there's tons of operational stories that somehow I got cleared by CIA.
Can I ask, so let's talk a little bit more about, like, when you say that, like, the CIA is like a different breed, or that you like, and I'm looking like right now at like the Amazon write-up of your book, and there's like 4 bullet points about like how leaders can apply to meet any crisis, on like core principles, right? And I think that, so just to like give the audience like an idea, like your core principles of how to gain confidence for the next implementation of guidance in the Mad Minute section. And I think that I haven't read the book, but what I'd like to talk about for a second is like, we were talking in the the pre-pregame show, like behind in the green room, just kind of briefly about kind of this parasympathetic or sympathetic responses that you've done with like therapy at Walter Reed and things like that. Kind of the idea of using meditation to work through things and not using maybe like your forebrain, like your reasoning skills. Like one of the things that I think is really interesting is the idea that there are a lot of problems and a lot of like emotional like kind of issues that you can't reason through. You're never going to be able to talk yourself out of like anxiety or a terrible headache. There are just like, right? There's just kind of like, there's just certain like other types of things that you can do, like relaxing your body and trying to talk your body into calming down, right?
Yep.
What I think is interesting is that I think the same way about leadership to a certain extent. Like, I don't know that you could give someone these bullet points and that they would become a good leader. And so like, how does one integrate kind of what you put into this book into kind of actually making it something that they can do on the ground?
Sure. So no, that's an easy question, right? So we can, and I think when you kind of you lay it forward like that, I'll start off with kind of the simple precept. And just like you talked about some of the difficulties I'd gone through with kind of health issues, like, life is hard. So leadership is hard, and anybody can lead in times of, whoops, hold on. My computer.
Marimba.
All right, hold on. I got to come back to you now. There we go. Anybody can lead during times of, when times are good. That's easy. Whether you're in the business world and the market's doing great, or if you're a doctor or a nurse in the ER and it's not a busy shift, that's easy. But one of the things that we kind of dealt with at CIA all the time is that we live in this area of gray, and I always talked about that. We want that gray, which is, you have a lack of situational awareness. Maybe there's physical discomforts, maybe there's a lot of pressure on you. Certainly you don't. There's ambiguity everywhere, but you have to make that gray your happy place. And so, and there's all these old adages about, the firemen run to the fire. So when times are hard, you want to be the one who kind of, who says, send me. And that happy place where if there's a lot of confusion, or that place where there's a lot of confusion, that becomes your happy place. And so that's what, that's what I encountered all the time, because that's the life of an intelligence officer. So at the end of my career, what I did is I kind of dissected a lot of things that I've done over the years, and I came up with this kind of leadership paradigm in order to build a team, build those leadership skills that I pass on to others, and so where you can operate in that area. And so there's just 9 core fundamental principles that I found really work for me. And then again, the key thing again, and what makes it, I think, real and authentic, is that so much of this was built on times of failure. And so, that kind of my message to everyone, again, I'm not kicking down doors. I'm not, thumping my chest and saying we're going to go, grab high value targets. I might talk about that in my book, how we did that, but it's all based on how we failed before and learned from it. And so I think that's where, it really becomes authentic. And the principles are really simple and basic, but it's how you get to that place later on when you're happy in that gray. You're like, I got this. Like, everyone else is like, this is time of chaos, and you're feeling really comfortable, and you can make decisions that way.
So, walk us through your own history at the CIA. So for people who don't understand the structure of the CIA, they may, like, there's a lot of people who show up on TV who are, I think they're in, broadly speaking, two categories. One is ex-CIA directors, the John Brennans, the Mike Haydens, the Mike Morrell. He gets a little acting before, but you know, the sort of the John McLaughlins, right?
Sure.
The people who were really, really senior. And then there's the former CIA officer, which is, you know, can mean a lot of things.
Sure.
In your case, you were a big time operations guy. So, like, give us a little bit of a sense of your history at the agency and who you are.
Sure. So, so I joined the agency in 1993. I was recruited out of Cornell University. I'll never forget that because, when I had my recruitment interview, there was a officer security, agent there with an earpiece because I think they were worried about protests at Cornell. So off I went. I actually joined as an analyst for the first 2 years. And I went into the director of intelligence. I received my master's from Cornell in the Middle East Studies. And so I went and I remember, I did that for a bit, and I went to my group chief and I said, after I took a long trip to the Middle East, I said, I think I want to become an operations officer. My group chief at the time was John Brennan. And Brennan said, sure, go do whatever you want. And of course, when I think about that now and when I've joked with John Brennan, it's because I probably was a really lousy analyst. And so off I go. And then I went into, this operations role. I got got my operational training. One of your former guests was one of my instructors, John Cipher. So we always joke that whatever I turned into was because of him. And then I went off and spent, a large majority of time in the Middle East, in multiple postings overseas. And then a lot of that time was in war zones of Iraq and Afghanistan, where, again, operations that we run, the stakes are really high. Our officers are at risk, but also the agents that we recruit are at risk too. And I talk about in the book how, both, failure, for me, for the CIA, meant losing officers under my command or losing agents, and that happened to me in both occasions. And was was really traumatic, but it really taught me a lot. And so I ended up having a career where I have a lot of fancy hardware in my basement, from intelligence medals, and I have to talk about it when I promote the book and stuff like that. But in reality, I wasn't all that much different than my other colleagues. Just men and women in clandestine service who really operate in the shadows, and those are my people. And I think the American public owes them a huge debt of gratitude because our successes are never heralded and our failures sometimes are on the front page of the paper. But the lessons we learned in kind of in this secret world, again, of operating alone, of doing things that really matter and with really high stakes. That's what I really wanted to kind of put into the book. So the book has these principles, but it has a ton of operational stories that I think people will really really be interested in and relate to as well.
Go ahead, Ben. Oh, I was going to ask you to tell us one of the stories.
Sure. So
I was going to say what your favorite of, like, if there's a favorite, like what, like your favorite, like if we were at a dinner party, like which would be the one that you of like to tell us?
So, at the risk of not promoting the principles, which is kind of the foundation of the book, the one story that's in the book though, because I do talk about, what it means to be an operations officer, and it's a story I love telling, is when I was a more junior officer, I was posted in the Middle East capital, which I, of course, can't name, but it was a high counterintelligence threat, and it was a country that was not a friend of the United States. And my task was to handle. I didn't recruit this agent, but I had to handle an agent. And I went off and during the kind of the training phase and preparing the agent for deployment, we went to Europe for several weeks, and I trained him on kind of surveillance detection methods, communication methods, things that in a denied area, would allow us to meet but keep him safe. And he sat down with me, and this was, it was an amazing time. And he looked me right in the eye and he said, and it's in the book, and I talked about it, and he said, Mark, I know that, you have other responsibilities, and we're probably going to meet once a month. And you're not going to think about me all the time. You're going to watch Armed Forces Network, and you'll watch football back in America. You have kids, I know that. But he said, let me tell you something. I'm going to think of you every single day, because if you make one mistake, I'm going to die. My whole family's going to die. My whole tribe is going to die. And so, and so you have to be perfect. And I need you to understand that. You have to be perfect in keeping me alive. And I was totally taken aback by that. And so, think about it as a junior officer, you're probably, 30 years old. and you have this person's life in your hands. And so, not only is the intelligence this individual is giving the United States government of importance, of great importance, but more importantly, frankly, to me, as a human to human contact, is this person's life is in my hands. And so I talk about this because operations are it's not a Psych 101 class, it's a Psych 501 class. And that's the intense personal bond you have with the agents that you handle. And so I love that story, and I hope kind of people understand that, because the men and women of the CIA who do this, who handle these agents, have a tremendous responsibility, and it really motivated me to get things right. Fortunately, this individual, he's defected now, he lives somewhere else, but he made it, and so I upheld my end of the bargain.
So link that back to your concept that all these stories involve movement from failure. Walk us through how this leadership principle.
Yep.
I mean, there's some level at which it's obvious. If
Sure.
the stakes are high, people die if you don't succeed. But presumably, the leadership principle is a little bit more evolved than that.
So perfect segue into this. So one of my principles, I call it the process monkey. And so process is something everyone hates in an organization. But what I kind of talk about, as a key principle is you as a leader and you as an organization have to identify those key processes that are fundamental to your success. So what is it in the intelligence world? It's called a surveillance detection route. So when I'm going out to meet that agent, who's relying on me to keep him or her alive, I have to do something that's called, we call a surveillance detection route, an SDR, which means going from, A to D, but you're going to make a lot of stops along the way. Maybe I'll be in disguise. Maybe I'll switch vehicles. Obviously, I have to see if someone is following me, if a hostile service is following me. That is a fundamental, process. That's like, a Navy SEAL has to be able to shoot a weapon. A nurse has to be able to, administer an IV. A doctor has, certain things they have to do. So in my world, this is what it was. It was a surveillance detection route. So I talk about one of the operational stories. I'm in the Middle East, and I'm off going to an operational meeting. Washington, loves the agent that I'm handling. It's critical intelligence, and just like everywhere else in the Middle East, there's tons of traffic. And so I go through this story. As I'm going through my timing stops, I realize I'm going to be late. Now, guess what? I'm alone. Nobody's going to know if I cheat. No one's following me. It's all based on my integrity. I know I'm missing my timing spots, the places where I'm supposed to see if I have surveillance. And what do I do in the end? Well, I abort the meeting. I don't make the meeting. My station chief's pissed. Washington's not happy, but that's a fundamental process that I've identified, in which is critical for the success. And so, and when I talk about leading in times of ambiguity, there are fundamental processes like that. So when down the line, there are times of ambiguity. There's times, where there's a lot of chaos. That there's some processes that you follow, and so that's kind of the example I give, which relates, of course, right back to the original story about keeping that agent alive.
What would have happened if you had missed some of those checkpoints, do you think?
And yeah, so two things. So probably nothing. Assuming I didn't have surveillance, nobody would know, and so it's all based on me and my integrity. Now, if I did have surveillance, and I didn't go through those kind of correct stops, I might not have been able to detect someone following me, and the agent would have been wrapped up. So the stakes are really high if you're wrong, so that's it, and it's a perfect example that goes to the real world. A lot of time, if a police officer doesn't give Miranda rights to a suspect, maybe the judge doesn't know about that. Maybe it goes to trial and the criminal gets convicted. But you know what? They've got to do that, and because if they don't do it, then the judge, and it comes out in trial, criminal gets off. So, you have to identify these fundamentals. And what I do after each section, I did something that's called the Mad Minute checklist. Now, the Mad Minute in operations means you have 60 seconds as an operations officer when you go to a meeting to kind of cover the most important stuff. So what I did is after each section where I discuss my principles, I'll go, I ask the reader to go through a checklist. So, what is your process? Identify the process that you and your business and your line of work, is most important, to sustain, in terms of integrity and honesty. And so that's why I think, this is useful kind of as someone reads it. It can't be that this is only for kind of type A, crazy Intel spec ops people. This has got to, someone gave me a great piece of advice. They said, a librarian has to read your book and like it. And I said, all right, got it. And that made a lot. I love librarians. I love going to the library. But that made a lot of sense to me because it's got to be relatable.
So I want to relate this episode back to your prior appearance where you talked about the agency's failure to deal with the Havana syndrome issues and people, including you, in a serious way. This seems to me to be a pretty substantial leadership failure. And I'm interested in whether you identify principles in the book that were violated in this instance.
So that's a fantastic question. So the answer is yes, and I will talk about that in a second. But one of the things that I wanted to, there's the end of the book. I talk a little bit about what happened to me, but I didn't want to do that for a reason. The book was kind of a cathartic experience writing it, but I didn't want to kind of hook it all into what I was going through. But inevitably I did, in one of the principles. And the principle that I talk about in the book is called family values. And that's kind of a hokey principle, but it's obvious what it means. It means taking care of the people around you. And so I think there was a tremendous leadership fail, under the previous CIA administration. It's changed a lot under Director Burns. But fundamentally, in the past, they violated the pact where, so someone asked me as a CIA officer to do some really crazy things over the years. I was involved, I think, in every covert action program in the Middle East. But I always knew that if I got jammed up in some fashion, particularly health-wise, that someone would have my back, and they didn't. And so ultimately that was a huge leadership fail. But let me go back to some of the stories I talk when I say family values, and that's fostering an incredible spirit of teamwork. I went into Iraq in late 2002 up in a team living up in Kurdistan, and then from there I was pulled down to go in with Naval Special Warfare for the high value target hunt. And the chief of station in Baghdad at the time was a guy by the name of Charlie Seidel, who was a legendary Middle Eastern operations officer. I've written about him in some other pieces I do. He's passed away now, but he was what I call the last great American Arabist at the CIA. But after Iraq, after being there for almost half a year, I came back and I had some pretty severe PTSD syndromes of all the stuff, the crazy things we did. And he knew that. So what did he do as a leader? He gathered the entire team we had in Baghdad, and this was, maybe a dozen of us and all of our families, and he invited us to his cottage on Cape Cod for 2 weeks. And he knew I was having a really rough time. I was having terrible nightmares. My wife was really worried. I was seeing dead bodies everywhere. And he said, Mark, bring your family up there. And he gathered the whole team. And for 2 weeks, we all sat around and ate lobster and drank beer. And he gathered the team together. He got that leadership principle. I mean, I get chills now talking about this because it's so basic and fundamental, but he understood it. And I think, I compare that with how the agency kind of treated me when I was, basically begging for health care. And it's, it's night and day. And so I think there are things you do when you build teams. And again, when I'm talking about how to lead in times of crisis, how to lead in times of ambiguity, lack of situational awareness, that's the kind of team you want to build where people have that love and loyalty to each other. And so, great example, kind of, what happened to me in the past, but also, examples I gave in the book as well.
And do you think that the leadership failure at issue here, was this a Gina Haspel, Mike Pompeo failure? Was it a Trump administration failure? Was it it had to have been at least at their level because they were quite aware of the situation. What do you attribute the failure to take care of the people to? Was it, it's not, was it not wanting to embarrass the president on a Russia matter? Was it unrelated to the larger political ambience? How do you evaluate it?
So, obviously I've thought of this and I've been asked this question, not only here, but also by the Hill and even by kind of current agency leadership. So, because it doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, after I went public with with the article in GQ in October of 2020, three former CIA directors called me and said, why are they not giving you treatment? And then they weighed in with the agency in reverse course. But everyone had that same question. They fundamentally didn't understand why the CIA leadership, did not take simple action. And so, this is not to say, I mean, all they had to do was get us health care. You don't need attribution on this. So that's the thing that nobody can understand. So forget.
That's what I'm having trouble understanding, frankly.
And everyone wants to kind of blame the CIA leadership for not taking this kind of alleged Russia matter. I mean, I think it's the Russians, but to Trump, but you don't even have to do that. If an employee of yours is sick, get him help. We'll figure out, who's responsible for the car accident later. But you're going to go to the hospital if you're banged up in an accident. So, that's the thing. So what it comes down to, what I've concluded now is certainly senior leadership failures occurred, and that's on that's on the shoulders of those who were in power at the time. But also it goes to what I think were problems with our and this is getting more into the weeds, our Office of Medical Services and the senior officials who were there at the time, because fundamentally I think they were protecting the institution and not the personnel. I think if you see, I got to be careful when I say this, if you see press reports, Bill Burns has made changes there in our Office of Medical Services, which is the right thing to do, because I think that he understood that there were some problems as well, and so maybe it's almost like an airplane crash. All these things kind of happened at once, where senior officials in our medical staff, were not really interested in helping us, and then senior agency officials made some really bad choices as well. And look, this is not just me. I mean, one of the things that I sort of turned into now is an advocate for the health care of those of us who've been affected by directed energy attacks, including those at the State Department as well. And the list is pretty big and growing. There's a whole cohort of us who I see at Walter Reed all the time. So it's not just me. And so it's fundamental that the agency and state and DoD has to take care of its people, even as they try to figure out what happened. Just take care of your people and get them health care. I mean, that's leadership 101.
Is there any precedence for this ever happening before? Like this, like just the pure denial of healthcare?
Yep.
Like,
well, of course there is. There's Agent Orange. There's Gulf War syndrome. There's the NFL and their battle with CTE and TBI. I mean, that's what, to me, the analogy I always make is, okay, so the CIA, as it not now, because under Director Burns it's been much better, but before is, hey, this is the NFL 15 years ago when everyone was saying there's no problem, and it turns out there was an enormous problem, and so. But then I end up going to a place like Walter Reed's National Intrepid Center of Excellence, their TBI program, and in fact, the matter is DoD is far ahead of everybody on this. And so I think there is precedence in the past, and it seems like many didn't look to the past, look to history for lessons.
Yeah, but with all due respect, I think you're being too generous here.
I know.
agree.
Because the NFL 15 years ago was faced with the possibility of that its business model involved traumatic head injury. And so it did something similar to what the tobacco industry did in the 50s and 60s, which is it denied the premise.
Right.
The CIA's business model is not threatened by these domestic energy attacks any more than directed energy attacks, any more than it would be if, the FSB or the GRU were out, say, poisoning people, which, by the way, they also do. This is a challenge that an adversary apparently is doing, and that causes damage and pain to our people and disability to our people, and poses a geopolitical challenge. It doesn't say, well, traumatic head injury is being caused by intelligence work, which would be the analogy to the NFL situation. I think it's not normal denial; it's abnormal denial.
Yeah, I think it's based on the unknown as well. But I will say, I think that it does offer not an existential threat, but there is considerable worry. Look, I'm still connected with all my friends and colleagues on the inside. People are worried about this. This is happening at a rate which is is grown, and the media has picked up on it. But when you see numbers that the New York Times reported in terms of 130, so people are going to start worrying about taking their families overseas when these things are happening. So I think Director Burns understands that this is not necessarily a crisis situation, but it's something that has to be dealt with very quickly.
can I ask how much of this is sui generis or like unique to like the CIA? Like how much of this is assumption of the risk when you're doing covert ops and doing this type of thing, that you're not like the NFL, you're not like the, you're not like all of these various types of tobacco industry, that actually like you came into, it's like kind of the opposite, Ben, in a way that like you came into, it's like going into the tobacco industry knowing full well you're going to get maybe going to get lung cancer, and so like at the end of the day, like what do you want us to do, take care of you when you get lung cancer? Like that type of kind of attitude. I don't know if does that make sense at all?
Well, no. Look, there are certainly things that we do in our line of work that are dangerous. I mean, I served in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think in both places I came very close. In fact, one of our security personnel, won the Intelligence Star for saving my life in Iraq when I almost was killed. But it's still not something you expect. I mean, there are 137 stars on the wall, and it's a very somber place to go visit. But I think that and so I look back and I'm like wow, I almost kind of bought the farm in war zones, and I end up really getting injured and had to retire after an event in a 5-star hotel in Moscow. I mean so I guess your number is up somewhere, but fundamentally this is kind of more insidious because it's this kind of unseen unknown, and I think one of the things I tell this story all the time that there's things we do at Walter Reed when you get treatment for this, and there's one thing, it's called art therapy. And one of my colleagues at CIA who's still in, who was affected by this, painted this picture. It's a black canvas, and on the black canvas is a red splotch, which looks like blood, and it was amazing. We all kind of were stunned when he did this. That signifies what we wish was a gunshot, because then it would be this visible wound. And so the directed energy issue is so strange and unusual. And people, obviously there's people in the media who don't believe this. It leaves a lot of room for doubt. But I always say, I say all the time, I wish I was shot. Then the former agency leadership for OMS would have given me treatment.
Well, you can't gaslight someone that gets like a bullet wound. Like that's like, right? And this is like, they really found out the real weak point, right? Which is that you take a bunch of spooks who are naturally paranoid, and then you give them like a complete extra. I mean, it's kind of, to be totally honest, Mark, it's kind of like a really cruel type of torture, like beyond the actual physical. Like it's like cruel and like unusual in like many different respects because it's so twisted.
Done, it's being designed to incapacitate. No one's dying from this.
Right.
And it causes confusion and doubt. And of course, look what it's done internally within CIA. Look what it's done internally within the U.S. government. In terms of and this is there's a lot of incredible operations officers who've been taken off the battlefield by this, and so if you think about it, it is in one way it's an ingenious weapon, but I think that again the numbers are growing so high now. I think we're past the point of anyone questioning this or not. I mean that to me what I faced several years ago is not what I face now. Within CIA, people really do understand that something really bad has happened and is continuing to happen.
Christopher Argyris, you have a series of questions.
Sure.
And I actually can ask all three. Great. Okay. So the order that was put in. Okay. So good evening, Mark. It is said that it takes about 3 years to train up a new agency officer, and about 5 years for them to reach their full capacity. Why does the agency continue, as you quoted a colleague, to eat its own? From a general outside view, those officers without public profiles who we know on Twitter or who speak in the media, obviously that's a small percentage of people. Those people may have stayed for 10 or 20 years, like you, but there's a lot of people in the public eye who maybe stayed 3 or 5 years and didn't wash out, but sort of left the agency under, disgruntled circumstances or sort of unhappy circumstances. How does the agency reform itself to get a better return on investment in young officers, so we don't get this sort of washout and moving on to bigger and better things?
Sure. So this is a fantastic question. So it's something I've actually thought about a lot, and I wrote a piece on it. I do a weekly column on intelligence for the Washington Examiner. So one of this had to do with how we treat our formers, and it's something that was really bothering me because how the agency was treating former officials was not so great. I actually have talked about this with Director Burns, who wants to try to help. So first and foremost, you have to separate, the junior officers who come in. When I entered the CIA, in 1993, it's the only job I